I feel a little bit like an NPR news correspondent or something here.
Uh-huh.
It's very unique, but we're basically your NPR podcast tour guides through this Foxverse X-Men journey.
One snippet at a time. No, I'm not going to try a pun there.
Here, stop. Here's the deal. Days of Future Past slaps.
Yep.
I love this movie. I love it probably more than you. I don't know if that's fair to say. You love it.
I think that's fair.
But I love it. I remembered it being good. A lot of people herald this film up there. They hold it up with X-Men 2.
Which is fair.
As kind of the two top films. This is pre-Logan. And I think I agree with that. But then when I went back and watched it, I don't think I realized once I was invested in what they were doing, how much I would like it.
Yeah.
I remember it being a good film, but now I have the history with a lot of these characters. And in a lot of ways, this movie is the end game of the X-Men universe. And I think there's a pre and post Days of Future Past on both the timeline front and kind of the, like what they're shooting for in making films front.
Yeah.
In general, like this is kind of the closing of that original chapter. And I think in a lot of ways it does it spectacularly well. I think the plot is actually genuinely fascinating. I think in general, the performances are dialed up. This is where you get some really, really great Fassbender and an even better McAvoy and Jennifer Lawrence, I think, from what we've been getting. This film allows the new cast to shine. And like in a lot of other cases, this is where Hugh Jackman really rips. I mean, this is prime Logan because he's the one chosen to go back. And so you get a lot of Logan time, but you get this awesome vibe of a future Logan in the 70s and kind of reliving an era.
Yeah.
And it just makes for a really fun fish out of water, but it's Logan kind of thing. I'm into this movie on all fronts. I think Trask is genuinely terrifying. And I think the Sentinels really pose a genuine threat that helps me as the power levels guy to feel the impact of where this is going. Like I feel like they can't win regardless.
But what I also love is that they put a lot of space between the initial iterations of the Sentinels that we see in the 70s.
Good point.
To how they evolve. Like I like seeing that.
Good point.
Even from like a kind of a power level perspective, but also
and just a
design.
detail, like a thoughtful detail.
Yeah. And man, this is the movie where First Class had really interesting moments of it with the Cuban Missile Crisis and just the way that it's all rooted in Cold War stuff. I like how 70s this is with like the Vietnam aspect, with Nixon, just with like the general cultural vibes.
No doubt.
I think that this is the last time that they really nailed that aspect. I think that the rest of the series would have been better if they had not felt bound to a decade for a lot of reasons. But here, it works really, really well.
This movie in general changes so much for the X-Men universe, and it's something that we discuss on all of our episodes basically from this point on.
Yeah.
The timeline aspect of the Fox universe is so confusing, and this movie really doesn't help its case in that way. In some ways, this movie is physically rewriting a lot of the stuff that we just watched, kind of rendering some of it obsolete.
Yeah.
So this movie's not perfect is my point. I freaking love it, but I can see how if you were a fan of maybe some of the originals, like how some of the originals went, having that erased might not be your favorite thing, although the movie still does a really good job of honoring that stuff while it's doing it. From where this film happens to where the X-Men universe goes, I think is where this conversation is going to get really, really interesting, because instead of using this film as the end game and really kind of wrapping that saga, there are a few films upcoming that maybe don't handle Days of Future Past with the right amount of reverence that they should.
Yeah.
Like where the next logical step happens is kind of weird.
Because I think if you're going to keep going, then I wish that, one, we didn't immediately jump to an apocalyptic threat, literally, which we'll talk about in a second.
Yep.
But also, I am curious, okay, history's been rewritten now. We don't know anything. We actually don't really know that much about what was going on with the X-Men between the 60s and 2000 anyway. But we certainly don't know what the next steps are after this big showdown in front of the White House, which obviously changes like that in the 2000 film, mutants are still like kind of underground, and so an event like this never would have occurred. So I wish that we would have seen just like, if this was day zero of the new timeline, like I'm happy to see day one, or at least like
people just wake up and go to their jobs and drink some coffee and have lunch.
I do. I think that this is an interesting study in. This occurs in a lot of franchises like this, superhero franchises especially, but we talk about this being the end game of the X-Men films. I think that something comes with that is hard to effectively move on from because there are just so many pitfalls. I'm not saying it can't be done. It definitely can. But like if you look at this, if you look at like, I'm excited about the way they ended No Way Home, for instance, because they gave a really clear, great path forward where like I think the next director that comes in can kind of pick it up without having to get super creative. And maybe they did that here, but I think what I'm getting at is not a particular plot element, but it's more that by closing off things, you're also getting very like self-referential, maybe even navel-gazy, which is okay if you're doing a...
Don't say navel-gazy ever again.
It's not okay, actually, unless it's your own navel. But I'm
not going to go there.
Think that the problem there is once you've done that, like once you've broken that seal and we now have a movie that is kind of about the X-Men franchise, or a movie that is kind of about the MCU, like Endgame is, where you're going back in and reliving moments. Same thing with No Way Home. Like, now, how do you just kind of turn the page and now you're back at a ground level story? Like,
for me, Far From Home, WandaVision are perfect for what that's supposed to look like. Apocalypse is another story.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think about it here because when we talk about X2, Days of Future Past, it is almost the exact same conversation for me as Spider-Man 2, No Way Home, where these are both, I think, peak versions of those kinds of movies.
Yep, but they're different things.
They're different things. One's very character focused, pretty like it's a lot lower stakes, kind of more intimate, and the other is like let's do a Spider-Man movie. Like let's do an X-Men movie, man. Like let's just like give the people what they want, and both of those are great. But I do think there are some dangers, and we'll talk about those soon.
Our episode on Days of Future Past is available now, and that's actually the second time that we've done an episode on this film. This film was such a banger that a few years ago, we offered our audience an option. What movie should we cover? And this was the movie that was chosen. So we did it then, but we still felt like we should come back to it during the rewatch journey. And boy, am I glad we did. I feel like this episode is even stronger than that one in that we picked up on some more stuff, some more insight. So go check out X-Men Days of Future Past, one of the best X-Men movies ever made right now on Friends from Work, wherever you get your podcasts.